All right, so good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Good morning, everyone. So this is crazy. You know, we've been delving in a little bit into this world of Piaget and behavioral psychology and sociology and rural sociology and all this stuff. And it's been a very interesting discussion. And obviously, I'm posting some of these on my YouTube page as well. And some of them are for you, the students here in this program. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank you all for being part of this, because I want to start this short lecture off with a picture, okay? And I want to try to paint this picture. So imagine a 3-year-old child in rural Texas, 100 miles away from the nearest pediatric speech therapist. Okay, and this child needs speech therapy or whatever it is. The family doesn't own a reliable car, okay? And even if they did, the question is, could they afford the gas for it, right? Or could they afford to miss work every week to make the 100-mile trip, 200-mile round trip to see the pediatric speech therapist, right? And by the time the child enters, and this is a 3-year-old, mind you, a pretty young child. By the time the child enters kindergarten, those delays in speech and language development, they're not just inconvenient, they're real. They're shaping this child's academic readiness, okay? Their social relationships, and their long-term outcome, their long-term future, right? Okay? This child has been damned for life because of where it was born. Just like a child in North Korea, damned because of where it was born, right? Now, I'm not saying, look, I know it sounds like I'm often being very critical of rural America, but that's not the point here. My point here is that this story that I'm telling you is not unusual. In fact, I think that it illustrates a very modern day central theme, and I'm going to allude to that today through this lecture. And that theme is how systematic barriers in healthcare, foster care, and social services, all three of them, intersect with developmental psychologists and what they call sensitive periods. Now, that's why I named this lecture Sensitive Periods in Social Capital, Rural Childhood Development, Healthcare, and Social Services. That's the name of this lecture. Now, a lot of you live in ivory towers. A lot of you live in, come from privileged backgrounds. Some of you may come from middle-class backgrounds, whatever the case may be, right? Okay, your parents can likely afford to send you here for 4 years so you can have your head filled full of all kinds of bullshit and deal with that goddamn professor, right? That you always complain about. But this is where we go a little bit deeper into this situation. And we're going to talk about these sensitive periods in these children. And I want to argue that the lack of timely and consistent support during these very limited windows of a child's development, I'm going to argue that this consistent support during this very limited window of rapid development does have long-term implications for rural children. And you're probably thinking, well, doesn't do the same thing for urban children. We're going to get into that as well. I think towards the end of this lecture, I want to propose, because what we do here is talk a lot about interventions, right? And we try to get those interventions to the marketplace, right? To the world, if you will. I'm going to suggest some ways that I think policymakers, activists, community leaders, whatever, can address these gaps by mobilizing local social capital, which in rural communities is very limited. It's very, very limited. Most people in rural communities have no clue what social capital even is, let alone what to do with it. But so here's how we're going to move through this, though. We're going to talk about sensitive periods in development. Then we're going to look at rural health care, foster care, social care systems. We're going to look at all of this, and then we're going to discuss this social care, or this social capital, as a resource for the intervention that we're looking at, okay? So let's talk a little bit about come with me here to this slide here. Let's talk a little bit about developmental psychology. And developmental psychology, Piaget, tells us that not all childhood years are equal, and not all childhoods are equal, okay? Sensitive periods are these little windows, these little gaps, right? Where rapid brain plasticity, and you heard this term a lot if you study developmental psychology. There's this rapid growth, right? And when children are particularly responsive to certain kinds of experiences and stimulation, right? For example, you could take language development, right? So let's talk about that. Most children acquire language skills before the age of 5, unless there's some sort of underlying circumstance or something there. Delays before the age of 5 can cascade literally into literacy challenges later on in life. You talk about nurturing and attachment and caregiving and stuff like this, right? Stable, responsive relationships in the first 2 years shape emotional regulation and trust. You know, Piaget did this when he was studying 3-year-olds, right? And how 3-year-olds learn morality, right? Through negotiation. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. Now, one of the most powerful studies, I think, ever done on this was called the ERA, okay? And that was called the English and Romanian Adoptees study, okay? And this was a very interesting study. It was where children were adopted from Romanian orphanages before 6 months old, often caught up developmentally, but those adopted later showed persistent deficits in cognition and social emotional functioning. The lesson to this, and you're probably thinking, for those of you who have no interest in this topic, probably think, well, Matt's just rambling, goddamn professor's just rambling about nothing. I'm actually making a point here. The lesson here is that timing matters. Missing these very early windows, we know this, missing these very early windows doesn't make development impossible, but it does make it much harder. So these kids who were brought in from these Romanian orphanages in this post-Ceausescu Romania, before the age of 6 months, they tended to do a little bit better. Why? Because they had the systems in place that they needed to survive. Now, you're thinking, how in the hell, Matt, does that apply to rural healthcare gaps and sociology? Bingo, let me explain. So here's a fact that according to the National Rural Health Association in 2022, nearly 80% of rural counties are classified as primary health professional shortage areas. In pediatrics specifically, only 1 in 10 pediatricians practices in a rural community, despite 20% of the children living there. What do you think of that? So then if you break this down even further, early intervention services like, such as speech or occupational therapy or whatever, are even more scarce in rural populations. Even more scarce. You think I'm kidding? Families often face round trips of 100 miles or more for services that urban families can access pretty easy. May not be the most convenient thing. Maybe you have to take a bus. Maybe you have to take a train. Maybe you have to drive a little bit. But rural folks, us country folks, man, we may have to take off work for this, man. Like a full day just to drive there. And then we got to go borrow money for gas just to get there, right? It's true. Now, I hear your argument. You say telehealth, and I hear that. I hear the telehealth argument. Telehealth has really emerged as a potential solution, I'll say that, to this problem. But a 2021 study showed that telehealth and teletherapy did kind of improve access to speech services for rural families by something like 35% or something like that when I was going through some of the data. But there's a catch to that, and that's broadband. That's broadband. The FCC reports, and this was pretty recently, I'm recording this, obviously in 2025 for this lecture series, but something like 22% of rural Americans had access to rural broadband, which is high-speed internet. That's quite a large compared to just 1.5 people in rural areas. It's quite a large number of rural people that don't have access to even remotely high-speed internet. They're still operating off of satellite or DSL, and things like Starlink, Elon Musk, Starlink are very, very fucking expensive. So in Texas, where I live in Texas, even after significant broadband improvements, there's still over like 30% of rural households remain currently without reliable internet. So telehealth is kind of off the market in a lot of places. It really is. Now, I think while these services do exist in theory, right, infrastructure barriers are keeping people from accessing them, and they're staying just out of reach. It's kind of like the pop singer Alanis Morissette from Canada said, it's like that transparent dangling carrot, and so kids, this reaching therapy and reaching help during these very sensitive periods is kind of like that transparent dangling carrot. You have options, but those options aren't always readily accessible, right? Especially during the years that they matter most. So now that we've got that out of the way, we're going to talk a little bit about foster care. A lot of you have probably heard the Casey family programs, stuff like that. We're going to shift a little bit to this foster care discussion. And rural children, I'm going to give you a stunning fact that most people don't realize. This is a fact, an absolute fact, okay? Hold on to your seat for this. Rural children are more likely than urban children to enter foster care. That was according to Casey. Did you know that? Quite the contrary to the idea that you've been fed, right? That rural families are solid. There's very little, going on. These kids don't end up in foster care, the solid family unit, all this. It's a fact. If you just break down the sheer numbers, rural kids end up in foster care a lot more than urban kids. In fact, it's like 1.5 times higher. It's pretty impressive. Why is this? I think substance abuse is one of them. Economic stress is another part of it. A lack of social services. These are all driving factors to why these rural kids end up in foster care so often and so much more. And I'm not saying that urban kids are immune to this or that they're any different. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying these things in rural communities tend to be a little bit more noticeable. But I don't think the challenge is in the entry rates, folks. I really don't. And I've talked about this before. The challenge is not with the numbers per se. It's with placement stability. So a kid goes into the CPS system, child protections we call it here. You may call it something different in your state. DFPS, Department of Family and Protective Services, whatever. Obviously, they want to try to get the child placed with relatives first if they can. God damn, in Texas, there's so many people locked up in prison these days for far less crimes. You may have grandma, grandpa, mom, and dad all locked up in 4 separate jails. It's quite bizarre how this works. So So a lot of times the kids just end up in the foster care system, right? And then, we've had this discussion. Judge Janice Jack down in Corpus Christi, federal judge, has been taking on the foster care system practically her whole damn career. Texas has a broken foster care system, and we're going to trust this government to take care of them? You see, especially during these very sensitive times, these sensitive periods, right? The key here is placement stability, okay? I'm going to take you away from mom and dad. I'm going to put you with X family. Okay, mom and dad go through programming and treatment. They earn you back. They, all this blah, 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 back and forth that DFPS does and CPS does. Foster homes are very scarce in rural areas. So a lot of times these children are picked up and they're moved from, Hale Center to Dallas, or whatever. Maybe not that extreme, but it does happen, and things like this happen. And without getting too far off into the weeds about the social care system, we start talking about things like kinship care and long distance placements and all this and that, right? All of these things have implications when it comes to care of a child. All of these things do. And the development of a child. Okay? All of them do. So frequent moves disrupt attachment during these sensitive periods, right? So if you take a 3-year-old and he moves from mom and dad to foster care to grandma to grandpa to foster care to aunt and uncle to whatever, and then ultimately maybe back to mom or dad or permanently into the foster care system. However it is, movement disrupts attachment during these sensitive periods. We know this. Long commutes to schools and services, this can further isolate these children, right? So you see, take a look at this fact. In 2020 Welfare Information Gateway report here found that children who experienced 2 or more placements in the first year of foster care were 30% more likely to face behavioral and emotional difficulties. What does this tell us? This tells us that this instability mirrors, in less extreme forms, what was observed in institutionalized children. Inconsistency in caregiving at critical moments does leave lasting marks. It does. So let's not lose sight of that. Now let's talk a little bit about the social services system, okay? So when I talk about social services system, I'm talking about schools, daycares, churches, and how these things often function as the default safety net in rural areas. But they're stretched beyond their capacity. I'm going to point to another study, 2020. National Center for Educational Statistics found that rural schools spend less than $1,000 per student per year compared to urban schools. That gap translates into fewer counselors, fewer special education specialists, fewer teachers, and ultimately larger class sizes. Let's take a look at daycares in rural areas. They often serve as the primary custodial care for working parents. They do. Kids actually spend more of their waking hours at the daycare than they do with their parents. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You can make that argument. And when it comes to these preschools and these daycares, right, a lot of them are under-resourced and they're understaffed. And the turnover rate, it can be pretty high. Probably not all of them, but some of them can be pretty high. What about the role of churches? Churches do play a role in this. They provide a lot of community support. But let's be honest, churches rarely have trained personnel, like truly trained personnel to address developmental concerns. Churches rarely have that. So, and then you add this to the red tape, to the government bullshit, right? Families often need food stamps. They often need Medicaid, prescription drug coverage or early interventions. That we could develop these interventions all day long. And there's a lot of red tape while you're navigating this system, right? A lot of times it requires stable internet access or reliable transportation or, hours and hours and hours of endless paperwork and, programming and training and rehabilitation and all this and that. For many rural families, these hurdles make support functions largely inaccessible. And that's bullshit. And that's bullshit. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time discussing here social capital because this is really important to think about. I pointed out a lot of problems, and I want you to go back and I want you to look at this kind of post-Ceausescu Romania and all of these orphans, and what happened in this ERA study, this England Romanian Adoptees study, right? I'll link that so you can in the I'll link that in the class documents for you to look at. And I've often complained about stuff here, but we focus here on social interventions, right? That's what we're looking at here. I think there's solutions. I believe that there are solutions. And I think that they begin with recognizing the strengths that us in rural communities already have, right? We already have some solutions. Sociologists describe social capital of networks of trust, reciprocity, and mutual aid. That's social capital right there, summed up. And these communities build this up over time. A lot of times, whether you even believe it or not, social capital is far more present in the urban communities than in rural communities. And it's much more effective. In rural areas, this often looks like grandparents raising grandchildren, aunts and uncles, neighbors stepping in as formal caregivers, churches mobilizing volunteers, whatever. And research suggests that children do best when they have consistent, responsive adults in their lives, regardless of whether those adults are parents, foster parents, extended kin, whatever it is. So what does this mean from a policy standpoint? I'm going to tell you because there's some debate on this in political circles. This means that policy, what I'm telling you is this means that policy needs to focus not only on building more institutions and building more red tape and building more problems, but it needs to focus on training and supporting informal caregivers, people who are not necessarily charged with being caregivers during this sensitive period of development, right? Simple programs like workshops for grandparents or shared family hubs within libraries. If you look at one of the interventions that I'm working on right now, you'll see that this is part of what I'm implementing in this intervention. But workshops for parents, family hubs and libraries and schools and places like this that can extend developmental support without requiring a whole lot of new financial capital, fiscal capital, and a whole lot more bureaucracy. So all right, so let's close this up. We've got just a couple of minutes. What can we take away from this? That's your question. What can we take away from this? Sensitive periods, I think, guys, reminds us that the timing of care matters as much as the content of care. The timing of care matters as much as the content of care. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways. Now, rural children face a lot of systemic barriers in healthcare, in foster care, in social services, and in direct parental development. And these often delay or dilute support that they need during these very sensitive times. And that's not talking negative of my peers out here in rural America where I live. And a lot of times, though, if you're a professional and you're looking at these things, right, sometimes they seem as insurmountable problems, and they're not. I think that by simply investing in infrastructure and strengthening community supports that are there, mobilizing local social capital that's already there, strengthening that social capital, trying to keep guys like myself who often, you go off to college or you go off to the big city and you work and you gain experience and you never bring that back to your hometown. Our hometowns are getting robbed of this social capital. We need to try to do something about that. I think that we can make sure that rural children are not quietly left behind. And we hear a lot about No Child Left Behind. I don't necessarily think that this did not leave children behind, because a lot of times No Child Left Behind really left the rural children out. So that's a whole nother topic. But so anyway, this conversation that we've had this morning, this lesson from both developmental psychology and rural sociology is very, very clear here, okay? Consistent, responsive care at the right time changes lives. There's no doubt about it. Consistent, responsive care at the right time can change a child's life. It can change somebody's life. And if we take that very seriously, we can design systems and interventions that meet children where they are at the time that it matters most. Okay? So some of you are required reading throughout this. I want you to go back and, because I don't think we do enough reading these days. Some of your required reading will be this ERA, English Romanian Adoptees. And I want you to also think about Nikolai Ceausescu, how, contraception, abortion, all these things were banned during Ceausescu's era, reign of communism. I want you to think about this. I want you to ask yourself how all of this, the religious elements played into this with Ceausescu. Nikolai Ceausescu, God, that was a disaster. God, that was such a disaster. Romania was such a disaster. It could have been a lot worse, but it was such a disaster, and I think we'll get into that later on. But so anyway, all right, thank you very much. I appreciate you. Thanks for joining us. Email me if you have any questions. All right, drop a comment in the thread. We can talk about it. All right, thanks very much.